The Sterling mansion was less a home and more a museum of silence. It stood on a hill overlooking the city, a monument of cold marble and glass that reflected the sky, but seemed to absorb no warmth from the sun. Inside, the air was still, carrying only the sterile scent of lemon polish and the faint, funereal perfume of lilies that were replaced each morning with funereal precision. This was the world of Alistair Sterling, a man whose wealth was so vast it had become a kind of armor, insulating him from the untidy mess of human emotion. His grief, however, was a crack in that armor. 6 weeks ago, his wife, Eleanor, had died giving birth to their son, Thomas. Now, Alistair's grief had curdled into a cold, simmering rage, a fury at a universe for its defiance, for taking the one thing he'd wanted and leaving him a fragile, wailing legacy he didn't know how to manage. Into the silent, grieving palace walked Sarah Johnson. She was a woman carved from a different kind of earth. Her quiet strength was not forged in boardrooms, but in loss. Her hands, though often calloused from work, were gentle. Her eyes, the color of warm, dark soil, held a sorrow so deep it had become a well of empathy. She had recently lost her own baby, a little boy named Leo, to an illness that had stolen him in the night. The ache in her arms was a phantom limb, and the milk her body still produced was a constant, cruel reminder of the life she could no longer nurture. She took the job as a maid at the Sterling mansion out of necessity, a way to keep the walls of her small apartment around her as she navigated a world that had suddenly lost its color. The true heart of the mansion's oppressive silence was, paradoxically, a sound, the incessant high-pitched cry of baby Thomas. It was a cry that seemed to hold all the world's misery in its thin, reedy notes. The baby was, in the clinical terms a succession of expensive pediatricians used, failing to thrive. He refused every brand of imported, scientifically engineered formula. He spat out the silver spoons of puree offered by his starched uniform nanny, Ms. Gable. He was wasting away, a tiny, pale ghost haunting his own gilded nursery. Alistair Sterling treated the problem as he would a failing corporate division. He threw money at it. He hired specialists, nutritionists, and even a sleep consultant who charged $1,000 an hour to whisper platitudes into a sound monitor. But Thomas's wails only grew weaker, more desperate. Alistair would stand in the doorway of the nursery, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. He looked at his son not with love, but with a terrifying kind of frustration, as if the baby were a defective product, a flawed heirloom. "He is a Sterling," he would say to the nanny, his voice a low growl. "Sterlings are strong. What is wrong with him?" Ms. Gable, a woman who lived in a constant state of low-grade terror, would wring her hands. "I don't know, sir. The doctors say he has no physical ailment. It's as if he has no will." Sarah heard it all. As she polished the silver and dusted the cold, lifeless sculptures, her heart ached with a pain that was both old and new. She recognized the baby's cry. It was not a cry of hunger for food, but a deeper, more primal hunger for warmth, for life itself. It was a cry she had heard in her nightmares, the cry she imagined Leo would have made. Every time she heard it, her own body responded with an involuntary pang, a ghost of the maternal instinct that had nowhere to go. One Tuesday afternoon, the crisis reached its peak. A storm raged outside, lashing rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows and mirroring the tempest inside the house. Ms. Gable had been sent on an urgent errand to a specialty pharmacy across town, and Alistair was locked in his study, his voice a low thunder on a conference call to Tokyo. That left Sarah alone in the main hall, cleaning the grand staircase, when the baby's cries escalated from a wail to a series of frantic, airless shrieks. It was a sound of pure panic. Sarah's hand stilled on the brass railing. Her training, her station, her very employment dictated that she stay put, that she remain invisible, but a force stronger than any rule pulled her up the stairs. The sound was coming from the nursery, a room she was forbidden to enter. She pushed the door open to a scene of quiet desperation. Thomas was in his crib, his tiny face purple, his limbs flailing. He was choking on his own cries, his little body rigid with distress. The air smelled sour with rejected formula. He was a tiny ship sinking in an ocean of silk and cashmere. For a moment, Sarah was paralyzed, caught between the memory of her own loss and the reality of the dying child before her. The world fell away. The cold mansion, the rich, angry man in his study, the rules of her employment. All she saw was a baby in need. All she felt was a searing, instinctual pull of a mother. She walked to the crib and gently, reverently, lifted the child into her arms. He was shockingly light, like a little bird. She held him against her chest, rocking him, her own tears beginning to fall. She whispered the same soothing words she had whispered to Leo. "It's okay, little one. It's okay. Mama's here." But the cries didn't stop. He was inconsolable, his little mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. And then Sarah felt it, the familiar, tingling rush in her chest, her body's answer to a baby's cry. An idea, terrifying yet profoundly natural, bloomed in her mind. It was a transgression, a crossing of a line so profound she couldn't even fathom the consequences. But as she looked down at the baby's pale, translucent skin and felt the frantic, fading beat of his heart against hers, the consequences ceased to matter. There was only this moment, only this life. With trembling hands, she sat in the plush rocking chair in the corner of the nursery. She unbuttoned her simple uniform, her heart hammering against her ribs. She brought the frantic, crying baby to her breast. For a second, he resisted, still lost in his panic. But then instinct took over. His tiny, desperate mouth found her. He latched on, and the world went silent. The frantic shrieking stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic suckling. The rigid little body went limp, melting into the curve of her arms. His eyes, which had been squeezed shut in agony, fluttered open, dark and unfocused, and for the first time they seemed to see. Sarah looked down at him, and the tears she had held back for weeks finally streamed down her face. They were tears for Leo, tears for Thomas, tears for the shared, sacred bond that transcended blood and class and the cold, hard lines of this house. In that moment, she wasn't a maid. He wasn't a millionaire's heir. They were simply a mother and a child, sharing an active life in a house dedicated to grief. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the entire mansion was a gentle, contented sound of a baby finally at peace. It was a silence that drew Alistair Sterling from his study. His call had ended, and the sudden absence of the baby's crying was more jarring than the sound itself. He assumed the child had finally exhausted himself into a fitful sleep, or worse. A cold knot of fear, an emotion he despised, tightened in his gut. He climbed the stairs, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the thick runner. He pushed open the nursery door, his lips already forming a sharp question for the nanny he assumed had returned. But the words died in his throat. The scene before him was one of primal, shocking intimacy. In the soft light of the nursery, bathed in the gray glow of the storm outside, sat his maid. Her uniform was undone, and at her breast was a son, Thomas, feeding with a placid contentment Alistair had never seen. The baby's tiny hand was resting on her dark skin, his eyes closed in a state of pure bliss. It was a portrait of Madonna and child, beautiful and serene, and to Alistair it was the most grotesque thing he had ever witnessed. His mind, a finely tuned machine of prejudice and control, couldn't process the humanity of the moment. It could only see the violation, the contamination, the lines that had been crossed. He saw a servant, a black woman, defiling his heir, his bloodline, his legacy, with something he considered unclean. His shock curdled instantly into a white-hot, venomous fury. He didn't shout. His voice, when it came, was a low, sibilant hiss that was far more terrifying than any yell. "What are you doing?" Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes, wide with mixture of fear and defiance, met his. She instinctively clutched the baby closer. Thomas, disturbed by the sudden tension, made a small, questioning noise but did not stop feeding. He was crying," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "He wouldn't stop. I was worried he would stop breathing." Alistair took a step into the room, his face a mask of pure revulsion. "Get your hands off my son." His words were like a physical blow. Sarah flinched, but she didn't immediately obey. The baby was still attached to her, still drawing life from her. To pull away felt like a violence she couldn't commit. "Mr. Sterling, please," she pleaded softly. "Just let him finish. He's starving. He's finally eating." I said, Alistair repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Get off him now. He advanced on her, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the chair. How dare you? How dare you put your filth on him? On a Sterling. The word filth hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was a word that stripped her of her humanity, that reduced her act of life-saving compassion to something dirty and vile. In that moment, Sarah's fear was eclipsed by a cold, hard spike of dignity. She carefully, gently, broke the baby's latch. Thomas let out a small, protesting cry, a stark contrast to his earlier screams. She held him for a moment, rebuttoning her uniform with one hand, her movements slow and deliberate, a quiet rebellion against his frantic rage. She stood and turned to place the now dozing baby back into his crib. Alistair snatched the child from her arms as if she were poison. Thomas, startled by the rough movement and the loss of warmth, immediately began to cry again, the familiar, hopeless wail. Alistair ignored his son. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, were locked on Sarah. You are a maid, a servant. You clean my floors. You do not touch my family. You do not contaminate my blood. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick wad of cash from a money clip, and threw it on the floor. The bills scattered across the plush white carpet like dead leaves. Take it. Take your money for the month. I don't want to see your face in this house ever again. If you are not gone in 5 minutes, I will call the police and have you arrested for assault. Sarah looked from his twisted face to the crying baby in his arms, and then down at the money on the floor. She didn't bend to pick it up. She simply looked back at him, her expression unreadable. There was no pleading in her eyes, no tears of fear. There was just a profound, quiet sorrow, not for herself, but for him, for the child in his arms. He was hungry, Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice clear and steady, and you are starving him. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the nursery, out of the mansion, and out of his life. The staff, who had heard the commotion, the cook peeking from the kitchen, the gardener from the hall, watched her go. They were all from the title. And the reaction that shocked them was not Sarah's act of compassion, but the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of their employer. They saw a man so blinded by his own prejudice that he would rather let his son waste away than accept help from a person he deemed beneath him. As Sarah walked down the long, winding driveway in the pouring rain, without a coat and without the money he had thrown at her feet, Alistair Sterling was left alone in his silent, cold museum, holding a screaming, starving baby. The days that followed were a descent into a special kind of hell for Alistair. The silence Sarah had broken returned with vengeance, punctuated only by Thomas's weakening cries. The baby, having had a taste of real nourishment and comfort, now refused the bottle with a renewed vehemence. He was regressing rapidly. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and his weight plummeted. The nanny, Miss Gable, was beside herself, and the doctors began to speak in hushed, grave tones, using words like hospitalization and intravenous feeding. Alistair's armor, wealth, and power was proving useless. He couldn't command his son to live. He couldn't buy a solution. The image of the peaceful, feeding baby in Sarah's arms haunted him. It was a memory that burned with shame and a terrifying, dawning realization. The filth he had been so disgusted by was the very thing that had quieted his son. The contamination was life. One night, after a particularly harrowing visit from the pediatrician, Dr. Evans, an old family friend who wasn't intimidated by Alistair's wealth, the truth was laid bare. Alistair was standing over the crib, watching his son's shallow breaths. He's giving up, Alistair, Dr. Evans said, his voice gentle but firm. What do the specialists say? Is there another formula? A new treatment from Germany? Japan? I'll fly them in, Alistair said, his voice ragged with desperation. Dr. Evans sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing his tired eyes. This isn't about formula, and you know it. We're not dealing with a business problem. We're dealing with a baby. They run on a different currency. Love, touch, comfort, things you can't buy. He paused, then looked Alistair directly in the eye. The nanny told me what happened with the maid. Sarah. Alistair stiffened. She overstepped her bounds. It was inappropriate. Inappropriate. Dr. Evans's voice rose with disbelief. Alistair, for God's sake, the woman saved your son's life, even if just for a moment. What she did, it's called wet nursing. It's as old as humanity. Queens and princesses have used wet nurses for centuries. It's not about bloodlines or status. It's about biology, about a bond. Her body responded to his need. He responded to her. He found a source of life, and you threw it away because you couldn't stand who it came from. The doctor's words were scalpels, methodically cutting through layers of pride and prejudice, exposing the raw, festering wound beneath. Alistair had no defense. He sank into the rocking chair, the same one Sarah had sat in, and put his head in his hands. The polished veneer of the powerful CEO finally cracked, and for the first time since his wife's death, he felt the crushing weight of his own failure. He was a king in a castle, and his heir was dying in his arms because he had banished the only person who could save him. The next morning, Alistair Sterling did something he hadn't done in decades. He asked for help. He got Sarah's address from his household manager's files. He drove himself, his sleek, black Bentley looking utterly alien as it navigated the cracked streets of a neighborhood he would normally only see from his office tower. He found her small, clean apartment building, walked up 3 flights of stairs, and knocked on her door. When Sarah opened it, she wasn't surprised, but she wasn't welcoming either. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear. There was no fear in them anymore, only a calm, assessing gaze. She was wearing a simple dress, and behind her, the apartment was humble but filled with a quiet dignity that his mansion sorely lacked. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice stiff and unfamiliar with the language of apology. I know why you're here, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even. She didn't invite him in. She stood in the doorway, creating a barrier he had to cross with more than just his physical presence. "My son, Thomas, he's not well," Alistair said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The doctors, they can't do anything. He needs you." Sarah was silent for a long moment, studying the man before her. The arrogant titan of industry was gone. In his place was a desperate, broken father. But she knew that desperation alone was not enough. "You threw money at my feet and called me filth," she said, not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating finality. "You accused me of contaminating your child for an act that kept him alive. What you need is not a maid, Mr. Sterling. What your son needs is not a secret, shameful fix to be hidden away when your guests arrive. What he needs is a mother's care. And what you need is to understand what that means." This was her moment of hidden power. She was no longer the invisible servant. She was the one with the leverage, the very life of his son, and she would not give it away cheaply. "I won't come back as your maid," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "If I return to your house, I return as Thomas's caregiver, his wet nurse. I will have full authority over his nursery and his well-being. I will have a proper contract and a salary that reflects the service I am providing, the service of keeping your son alive. And you will never, ever speak to me or treat me with anything less than the respect one human being owes another." She took a deep breath, adding the final, most important term. "And you will be there. You won't hide in your study. You will learn to hold your son. You will learn to comfort him. You will learn to be his father. I will feed his body, but you, Mr. Sterling, must learn to feed his soul. Those are my terms." Alistair was stunned into silence. He had come expecting to write a check, to offer a sum of money so large it would erase his transgression. He had expected to buy her services. Instead, she was demanding his humanity. She was demanding he transform. She wasn't just offering to save his son. She was offering to save him, too. Humbled, defeated, and for the first time in his life, truly seeing the woman in front of him not for her station or her skin color, but for her immense strength and grace, he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, of course. Thank you." When Sarah returned to the Sterling mansion, everything was different. She walked to the front door not as a servant, but as a savior. The staff looked at her with a newfound awe and respect. She went straight to the nursery, where Thomas was lying listless in his crib, His cries now just whimpers of exhaustion. She lifted him, and as she settled into the rocking chair and offered him her breast, the baby latched on with a desperate, hungry relief. The color began to return to his cheeks almost instantly. Alistair stood in the doorway, watching. This time, he didn't see a transgression. He saw a miracle. He saw the grace and dignity of a woman whose compassion he had nearly destroyed. Over the coming weeks, Sarah held him to his promise. She made him sit in the nursery while she fed Thomas. She taught him how to properly hold his son, how to read his cues, how to change a diaper. She would talk to Thomas in a low, loving voice, and she would tell Alistair stories about her own son, Leo. She spoke of his smile, of the way he smelled after a bath, of the immense, world-altering love she had for him. Through her stories, Alistair began to understand. He began to see his own son not as a legacy or an heir, but as a tiny, miraculous person. He started to see Sarah not as an employee, but as a woman of profound strength and a fellow parent who had endured the ultimate loss. His cold, marble mansion began to change. The oppressive silence was replaced by the soft sound of a healthy baby, gurgles, coos, and even laughter. Alistair started coming home from work early. He'd cancel meetings to spend an hour simply holding his son, feeling the weight of him in his arms, a weight that was no longer a burden, but an anchor. One evening, months later, Alistair found Sarah sitting by the nursery window, looking out at the city lights, with a sleeping, healthy, chubby Thomas in her arms. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stood beside her. The baby was thriving. He was the picture of health. "I never thanked you properly, Sarah," he finally said, his voice soft, "not just for saving him, but for everything. You taught me how to be a father. You brought life back into this house." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a respect and gratitude that was deeper than any business deal he had ever made. "My wife, Eleanor, she would have loved you." Sarah smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "She would have loved him," she corrected gently, looking down at the sleeping baby. "And she does, through you," in that shared moment of quiet understanding. The final walls between them crumbled. The power dynamic had been completely inverted and then rebalanced, settling not on wealth or status, but on a shared humanity, a mutual respect forged in crisis and compassion. The millionaire had been humbled. The maid had revealed her hidden strength, and a baby, caught between two worlds, had built a bridge of pure, simple need. The house was no longer a museum of silence. It was, finally, a home. True power is not measured in stock portfolios or the height of a skyscraper, but in the quiet dignity of a human spirit. It is found in the courage to give comfort when you yourself are broken, and the humility to accept it from the most unexpected hands. Alistair Sterling learned that his fortune could buy him anything but life, while Sarah Johnson proved that the wealth of compassion she carried within her was enough to save a world. In the end, it was not the maid who was humiliated, but the prejudice that sought to diminish her. It was a story of justice, not of courts and laws, but a heart where the currency of love and respect ultimately proves to be the only one that matters. For more stories that uncover the truth that lies beneath the surface of privilege, subscribe to our channel and join a community that believes in the power of a single, defiant act of kindness.